Good day, everyone. This is Mr. P once again. Today I'm going to walk you through the Assertive Assessor course. It's one of the series that we are looking at in the training space. Starting off from last week, we looked at the effective facilitator, and today we are looking at the assertive assessor. Just to give you a flashback of what we covered in the previous session, we looked at the effective facilitator. We were looking at all the areas that makes one an effective facilitator, and then we looked at the key definition of what a facilitator is, starting off with what it's not. We started off by saying that it's not a teacher, it's not a lecturer, it's not a professor, it's not an instructor. A facilitator is someone that creates opportunities for learners to learn through reinforcements and scaffoldings. They create an environment where people can own their own learning, and then they can build from exactly those constructs. We built this from the constructivist theory that states that people own their own learning. People tend to have knowledge that exists prior to the addition of the new knowledge, and normally when they get the new knowledge, it will be based on the constructs that already exist, that has been created by experiences, created by previous information, or created by a previous learning. So that's the whole idea of a facilitator. Today here I'm back again with the assertive assessor. I'm going to go into the detail of it, but we're going to all start off by the whole idea of an assessment. We want to break this this belief system that an assessor is a trainer or a facilitator or etc etc. That's what we want to try and bring it into an understanding. So I started off by looking at what an assessment is. This is within the context of the education. I know the word assessment has been used in so many spheres, ranging from insurance, motor industry, production factories, etc etc. But in the context of education, I came up with various definitions that I found online. Right. So let me delve right into those definitions right away. The first definition that I came across, it states that an assessment is a continuous planned process of identifying, gathering, and interpreting information about the performance of the learners, and may take several forms. So it's three aspects, which has to do with continuously planning process of identifying, gathering, and interpreting information about the performance of learners, and may take various forms. This addresses the issue that most of the people confuse, that an assessment is a test. It's not a test. They say assessment is an exam. It's not only an exam. Those are just tips in an iceberg of the whole context of assessment. So we will try by all means to try and clarify all of that. But as for now, let us understand that an assessment is a continuous process. It needs to be planned, and it involves identifying not just once, but continuous identification, gathering, and interpreting information about each of the learner's performances, and it may take various forms. This information is particularly used to understand and thereby assist the learner's development in order to improve the process of learning and also that of teaching. So clearly, when we look at the assessment, it's not just a one-time event. It's not something that happens between 4 to 5, like in an exam setting. That's just a tip in an iceberg. There is more to it. There are additional contexts that are involved. It is continuous. It is a process. So the second definition that I came across, it specifies that an assessment is a vehicle that is carrying teaching and learning forward. Thus, this analogy is used by various trainers in the assessment space. They normally view an assessment as that vehicle that is carrying teaching and learning forward. This analogy is very good in the sense that if ever one is going to involve or take a journey A journey involves the start off point and the destination. So within that start off point and the destination, there is a planning that needs to be put in place. Like, for example, if you're coming from Johannesburg and you're planning to go to Durban, you already have a destination that you want to reach. So during the time when you are planning for that journey, that vehicle that will take you from one point to the other is what we call an assessment. It is the go in between that carries the learning and the teaching processes right through to the destination. In this case, they are just like in a journey, there are roadblocks, there are regulations, there are signs, there are laws, and there are rules that govern that particular journey. Also, there are luggages that you have to put in place. There are people that will be involved before you get to Durban. So, getting to Durban is the final order. Getting to Durban is the final destination. Getting to Durban, let me use the term now, is the final outcome that you want to achieve. So, how do you get to those outcomes? How do you train in class? How do you promote learning in class so that it takes you from a point of not knowing to the point of knowing? That's what an assessment does. It closes those gaps. There are principles around it. There are roadblock and signs and regulatory signs that are there to create sort of regulations that promote the learning process. Right. So let's go through the steps of the whole process. Like we said, it's not just a one-time event. It involves various processes or various steps that are put together to coordinate the whole thing called an assessment. These are the processes. The first process or the first step in the process is planning and preparing for that assessment. The second step is in conducting an assessment, which is the gathering of the evidence. The third step involves the judgment of that particular evidence. It's still part of conducting the assessment, but you are looking at evaluation of that particular assessment. We also move on to step number 4, which is the feedback on the assessment, providing feedback. That is after you have given sufficient or satisfying judgment on an assessment, you then can provide feedback to whoever partook of that particular assessment. And then we do have the review of the assessment. What it means is this: we need to recheck the assessment when we're doing the planning and preparing, when we're gathering evidence, when we're evaluating the evidence, and when we're providing feedback. Was it to the best of the satisfaction, or was it to the satisfaction, or it needs to be rechecked, reviewed? And this becomes a continuous process, like what the definition stated, that it's a continuous ongoing process that involves all of these 5, if not 6 steps: planning and preparing, conducting the assessment, which is made up of gathering the evidence, judging the evidence, giving feedback to the learners, and then reviewing the assessment as a whole. There are different types of assessment, but we're going to go to only 4 with the ones that we generally use here at Sparrow. The first one is the formative assessment. A formative assessment is an informal or formal assessment that is used during the training. It can be an activity, it can be an assignment, it can be anything that can be an oral questioning, as long as it's something that is conducted within the training space. It can be an open book test. Anything that promotes and will create a learning environment, will promote learning, is what we call the formative assessment. This is informal in the sense that it exposes the learners to the whole training process, and then once they have been trained, we can move on to the second assessment. So the second type of an assessment is a summative assessment. A summative assessment is conducted at the end of the training. Now that a module is complete, the whole training has occurred. Now, at the end of the training, you need to assess and check the learner competence, check the learner performance based not on one another, but based on the outcomes of the evidence. Like in this case, we spoke about the destination. Now that you've done the training, you've reached that the achievement, you need to do an overall round up assessment, which we call a summative assessment. Then we do have a baseline assessment. It is something that you can go and read on in detail. And then of course we've got a diagnostic assessment. I'm not going to go into the detail of that because we generally have the formative and the summative assessment within the Sparrow training space. Right. So each and every assessment should comply with certain roadblock signs, regulations, and all of that needs to be put in place for us to say an assessment is credible. What does it mean to have an assessment that is credible? This assessment that is credible is an assessment that shows trustworthiness. The word credibility itself, it measures trustworthiness. Can we trust the assessment? Is the assessment, can we rely on the assessment? That's a reliability. Is the assessment done with integrity? Is the assessment done at a full authority? Is the assessment done with sincerity? Right. So credibility is implying all of these elements put together. So whenever we are looking at the assessment, it should satisfy all of these descriptions for us to say it's credible. Right. So how do we measure credibility? We identified the three different aspects of assessments that will then be measured against principles. So we'll delve right into the whole idea of the principles of assessment. Like we said, they are categorized in the methods that are used, the processes that will be conducted, and the evidence that will be looked at. Take note that these are not exclusive; they are working integral to one another. So, meaning that the principles are just there to ensure that assessment is done in accordance to the principles of assessment. They are done according to the requirements of the specific outcomes. So whilst we are still on the analogy of taking a journey from here to Devon, like we say, there are roadblocks, there are regulations, there are laws in place that govern that particular journey. So something applies to an assessment. There are also principles that govern that, so that whilst traveling from point A to point B, whilst taking the learners from a point of the unknown to the known, they can easily be able to do so without violating the principles. Right. So these principles are broken down into these three main aspects: the methods, the process, and of course the evidence. I want us to go right into it in detail. The first principle that is very important for us to satisfy, it is systematic. Right. Systematic is the process. It's asking whether the assessment process follows a logical step-by-step sequence: reflecting, planning, then conducting, then feedback, then a review of the assessment in the sequence. Systematic talks about order, talks about logic, it talks about coherence, meaning that there has to be that continuous flow of the steps, ranging from the time you do the planning to the time you conduct the assessment, collecting evidence, giving judgment on the evidence, evaluating the evidence, and then after evaluating the evidence, giving feedback back to the learners, and also doing a review. It has to be systematic. If one of these steps is cut across, then it means that we have become not logical in the way we deliver, and that creates a lot of confusion, and that creates a lot of problems when it comes to the actual training, because it means that the assessment is not credible. It has to satisfy all the points. Like we said, an assessment is not just about collecting the evidence like what many would think, but it is a combined integral process that constitutes of the planning, the conduction, the feedback, and of also the review of the assessment. The second thing that it needs to do, it must be an open assessment. The assessment process must always be transparent to the learners, or all other stakeholders that are involved, giving them the opportunity to contribute to the planning of an assessment. That's why we do have an assessment plan that sort of creates a meeting prior to the assessment so that the learner is given sufficient, so that the learner is given enough room to request whether they are ready, or to request an appeal, or to prove whether they are ready or not to take an assessment. So it has to be that much transparent. It has to be that much open, so that there is a clear process from the time it starts to the time it finishes. You give them the plan, you plan together with them, you then execute the assessment together with them. There is a meeting that needs to be conducted prior, and then when they do the assessment, they should be given the exact dates and the times that they will do the assessment. When an assessment has been conducted, we then can give them sufficient feedback. After we have done the judgment, after we have done the evaluation, we give them the feedback, and that after the feedback, then we can then review whether the assessment work went according to the process. You cannot ambush the learners with an assessment. They need to be given in advance, and that's what we mean by the principle of openness. The third one is reliability. The process must always be consistent, and it should yield the similar results under similar circumstances time after time, even when used by other facilitators. The reliability issue comes into play when it comes to saying that, is the process reliable? Is the process going to yield the same result whenever someone else, someone who is a subject matter expert in that area, also conducts the assessment? Can we still yield the same results? Is it something that we can depend on? That's what we mean by reliability. So each and every assessment, the process itself should comply with all of these principles. If one or two is missing, then we say the assessment was not credible. Right. The the fourth rather, it means that the assessment method, now this it's about the methods that are used. The processes we have already addressed, that there has to be that openness, that reliability, and also we mentioned that it needs to be very much transparent to the learners. Now the methods, when we talk about the assessment methods, we are talking about the techniques that you will use to collect evidence. Like in this case, we're talking about the assignments, we're talking about the written questionnaires, we're talking about the practical assessments, we are talking about the product sampling, we're talking about the submission of the POE. All of these are typical examples of the assessment methods. Each method comes with an instrument that supports that method. I'll repeat that. Each method comes together with an instrument that supports that particular method. For example, a questionnaire is a method, and then the instrument that goes with the questionnaire is a memorandum and a question paper. The second thing is a practical is a method. The method of assessment can be an observation, and then the instrument that we will use is an observation checklist. An assignment is a method. The rubric is an instrument. The oral assignment is an assignment, and then the oral rubrics and checklists are also assignment. So now, speaking of all of these methods, the principle that they should comply in is that they must be appropriate. What do we mean by that? We're saying that the methods you use, be it assignments, be it the tests, be it the practical observation session, it must be appropriate. The method used for generating, gathering, and evaluating or judging the learner's work, it must be suited to the content, the skills, outcomes, and topics that are prescribed in the curriculum. So if the specific outcome states that a learner should be able to solve mathematical problems relating to finance, the assessment should speak to exactly that. That's what we mean by appropriateness of the task. The method used should always be fair. What it means, we're talking about accommodation. It should be exactly the same in terms of time. It should accommodate language, the issue of language, the environment. It should also be able to be used to all learners without putting others at a disadvantage whilst others are at the advantage. It must be fair. For example, if I'm going to be conducting an assessment for typing, there is no need for me to create timing on the typing speed, especially if I have got learners with disabilities, like for example with a limited number of fingers. If one that has 10 fingers cannot type in the same speed to the one that has only one finger. So whenever I'm choosing a method of assessment that I will use, it will have to be fair. Besides being appropriate, speaking to the same specific outcomes that are stated on the SAQA guideline, it should also be fair. Give learners equal chance to be able to execute and demonstrate competency in that area. It should also be manageable. What it means by the assessor and the relevant role players remain in control of all assessment resources and procedures throughout the entire assessment process. It must be something that is manageable. In other words, the resources that are chosen should always be resources that can also be found, that are easy to find, easily accessible, and are appropriate and correct and manageable. Right. The fourth item on the assessment method, we're saying that it must be integrated. There is no way an assessment method can be talking on one area that does not speak to the other area in the real world. It must be integrated in the sense that the method requires learners to complete the activities that are the same as or similar to those done during the learning. It must be similar, and it should speak to what is expected of them also in the world of work. So what it means that there has to be that integration. There is no way we train today on an area that is exclusively outside the world. It has to be applicable. It has to be something that can be integrated with other modules, of course, with the specific outcomes, of course, and should be something that is applicable in the real world. Right. The next principles are addressing the issue of evidence. We say that the principles are categorized in such a way that we are focusing on the methods, the process, and also we are looking at the evidence. Right. So the methods, we have already addressed the issue of the process itself should be fair. The process itself should be open. The process itself should be reliable. The methods that are used, also we highlighted that the methods used should be fair. The methods used should be appropriate. The methods used should address all the learner needs. Right. Now the evidence that is produced by the learner, the evidence that is required of the learner, it should, number one, be valid. In other words, every evidence that the learner will produce and will gather, and it's evaluated by the assessor or judged by the assessor, it should always be directly related to the content. It should always be directly related to the topics, subtopics, the skills, the values, the specific outcomes, the uni standard requirements for that particular qualification. Or else, if one or two is missing, then we say that the assessment is invalid. It doesn't make sense to train learners that are expected to know how to change a tire. Then you assess them on how to make coffee. Those specific outcomes are not related in a way. So if you find an assessment speaking to one specific outcome and does not speak to the actual one that is written on the curriculum, then we say it's invalid. The evidence provided must always be current. What it means that it should always be fresh. It should be produced at the time or shortly before or after the time of evaluation of the judgment. There is no way we are going to pull evidence that was done 2 years ago to address a specific outcome that is assessed now, unless if there are arrangements like recognition to prior learning, We can pull evidence from the prior, unless if it's a credit accumulation system, we can always pull the data from then. But anything that's related to the assessment that is taking place at that particular time, you should always produce evidence that is fresh, that is also produced at the time of the evaluation or at the time of judgment. That's what we mean by the principle of currency. The third principle of evidence is that the evidence must be authentic. The authenticity is speaking about the declaration that the learner is the one who did the assessment. The learner assessed must be the one who does the assessment, not done on their behalf. Unless if it's a group assessment, then you should get engage with everyone. But still, when it comes to authenticity, it's actually declaration that nobody else did assessment, and the learner did it without an assistance of any other person. Once authenticity is questionable, then we say that the assessment is not credible. So the assessment evidence must be valid, must be current, and also must be authentic. The final principle of evidence is that enough evidence must be always be generated. Take note that if the evidence is not sufficient, if it does not address all SOs, if it does not address all unit standard requirements, then we can't uphold the decision of an assessor to declare a learner competent, because competence of the learner must produce sufficient evidence. Just like in the court of law, if evidence is not sufficient, there is no way the court can proceed. We say that the evidence was not sufficient. We therefore could not conclude that the learner is competent or not yet competent. We need sufficient evidence that will be produced. Take note that we are not referring to quantity. Sometimes quantity is not that much required, but the quality of evidence needs to be available and should always be sufficient. This brings me to the end of the presentation. Above all, with all the principles in place, may I bring it to your attention that you need to assess yourself on a yearly or daily basis and see how far you have gone and what skill or what you still need to work on. This is a quote by Sunday Adelaja. Right. We can talk about the principles. We can talk about all assessment methods, all techniques, and all instruments, and all evidence assessment processes. But if you do not take time to assess yourself, to check in terms of delivery, re-evaluating, reviewing, planning, and conducting the actual personal assessment, then we won't be able to achieve what we want to achieve. So it is always the best practice to ensure that you do a self-evaluation so that when you conduct assessment, it is an assessment that is credible. Thank you so much for showing up. I hope this is going to give us a refresher course on the issue of an assessment. All the best. Cheers.